Welcome to yet another in the series of Perth US Asia Centre Foreign Policy Conversations. Today, I'm especially delighted to be joined by Australia's ambassador to China, Mr. Graham Fletcher. I think many of you know Graham. He's kindly visited us here in Perth on several occasions in the past. One of the programs that we've most enjoyed over the 7 years of our existence has been a regular series of what we call ambassadors' dialogues around the beautiful round table in the Senate room at the University of Western Australia. Unfortunately, this year, those have been done largely virtually, and Ambassador Fletcher kindly agreed to do one of those just a few weeks ago. And the conversation was so rich that we thought it warranted a bit of a continuation that we could share with our broader community here in Australia and throughout the Indo-Pacific. Most of you will know Graham. He had served twice as head of the North Asia Division in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's had 3 previous tours in Beijing, previously as the deputy head of mission and 2 prior tours to that. Also served as deputy head of mission at the Australian Embassy in the United States as well. And was key to the negotiations around the 2014 Australia-China Free Trade Agreement. So Australia is well served having him on the ground in Beijing. He's been there as ambassador since August of last year. And I dare say it's been a rather eventful year plus now for Ambassador Fletcher. So Graham, thank you so much for making the time to join us today for this conversation.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you.
Now, obviously, there's been a lot that's taken place in the last year. Changes internally in terms of China and politics, in terms of its economy, in terms of security. But probably the headline story, not just in Australia, but around the world, has been COVID. We here in Western Australia have largely returned to normalcy, with the exception of the fact that we're cut off not just from the rest of the world and you in China, but we're also cut off from the rest of Australia. So much of the international discussion of the COVID-19 virus has focused on China and Wuhan in particular, but I don't think we've spent a lot of time updating ourselves about the situation since. Can you give us a little sense of a day in the life of China right now, their handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how that's impacting your operation in the Australian Embassy there?
Okay, yes. Well, certainly China, I mean, COVID started here and it hit China quite hard earlier in the year. And they responded with some pretty rigorous, comprehensive measures, especially in Wuhan and the province around it, Hubei province. And, you know, it really was a major focus for a few months there. That was, as others have experienced, you know, quite strict lockdowns and attempts to stop the spread. Now, since then, they've been quite successful, in fact, very successful in preventing further outbreaks. We've had a handful of outbreaks, Xinjiang up in the north, Beijing itself, but they've now got the tools and the experience to deal with these quite effectively. And so the rest of the economy and society has broadly got back to normal operations. It's not completely normal. There's still a bit of a lag in the economy, which is visible, and consumption and so forth. But in terms of safety, we just had the National Day holiday at the beginning of October, and around 600 million trips were taken by individuals up and down and throughout the country. And I myself, I've been to 4 different cities in the last month. And there's a tracking system which everybody essentially is part of using your mobile phone. And they want to know where have you been over the past 14 days, etc. And they can obviously detect that. And so as long as you haven't been in a hotspot, essentially you can go anywhere. And as soon as a new case is identified, they've got some very comprehensive tracing and testing procedures in place. There was one case in Guangzhou last week, someone who was working in a quarantine hotel. They have had a number of cases still coming in from people returning to China. That one person had 170 close contacts who were quarantined, 136 contacts of the contacts were quarantined, and then they decided, just to be on the safe side, to test people around there. So 116,000 tests were done, and they yielded no other cases. So that's the kind of throw everything we've got at it kind of approach. They realise, as everyone has discovered, this thing is really tricky to manage effectively, and if it gets out of control, then quickly one case turns into dozens and you've got a major outbreak. So they are really on their toes to try and prevent a recurrence of the problems that they had earlier in the year.
That's actually a stunning number, 116,000 tests in response to a single case. Do you have a sense for the transparency of China's response to this, at least right now? So obviously China is a very big country with a lot of different provinces. Do you have a sense, that they're open with how they're handling it nationally, not just in say, Beijing?
Well, the data is probably not the same that we would use ourselves. I mean, they don't count asymptomatic cases as official cases. They monitor them and they record them and they deal with them, but they're not listing them as formal cases. Now, I think the rest of the world would classify an asymptomatic patient as an official case as well. So then there's probably a percentage reduction on the number of actual cases, but we're pretty confident that they, from the top down, and this has gone throughout the entire system, they are determined to get on top of this. And everybody in the system knows if they don't admit to what's going on, if there's a problem and they try and cover it up, you can't cover it up. If you overlook an outbreak, it will spread and get worse. And so when they say there is an outbreak in such and such a place, we think that's certainly correct. When they say we have dealt with that outbreak and now things are back to normal, we see things are back to normal and we accept that. So, the trends are accurate.
You, in your initial response, mentioned the economic impact of COVID and a bit of a lag that's taking place in the Chinese economy. And now, look, obviously, globally, including in Australia, the first focus has been on the health and safety of the citizenry, whether it's in China or Vietnam or the United States or anywhere around the world. But there has been a tremendous economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, just in the movement of people and trade and students and tourists and the like. Could you give us a sense for the state of China's economy? Obviously, this is something of particular importance to Australia, given China's status as our largest trade partner. And so, how they've weathered, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the prospects for where it might be going for the rest of this year, or if you dare to prognosticate where it might be going next year.
Well, certainly the COVID outbreak hit China's economy very hard. They locked a lot of places down for a couple of months. Growth in the first quarter, I think, was down 6.8%, which for China is a scary number. They haven't had that kind of slump in living memory, well, at least for the last 40 years or so. They've bounced back reasonably well. I mean, they're still taking a hit, to just, as a guesstimate, probably 85 to 90% back to where they ought to be. Growth in the last quarter, I think, came in at 4.9% year on year, which is a little lower than expectations. And they think the prediction now is IMF and People's Bank of China are talking about a figure of 1.9 or perhaps 2% for the year as a whole. Now, for China, that's not a great outcome. I mean, they're normally tracking at around 6.5% or something like that. Growth has been slowing the last few years as structural change in the economy, etc. But compared to everyone else, I mean, every other G20 member, compared to OECD outcomes, 2% is a pretty good result. And I think China's leaders would be pretty happy that they're in recovery mode. For us, infrastructure spending is continuing, so there is demand for resources inputs. Consumption isn't quite back to where they want it to be, but it's not down too much. In fact, I think it's just retail spending is up 0.9% year on year to the same period last year. So they kind of got back to where they were. But for a country like China in its economic condition, they would prefer to be growing more quickly, of course. Your first question you asked, so what's life like back here? I should have mentioned movement within the country is totally free. Movement from outside of China in and out is still quite restricted. Coming into China, it's quite difficult for non-Chinese. If you've got a business here and you've been away, you can apply to resume your visa status in China. Chinese citizens, of course, can come back in. Everyone has to do 14 days quarantine. There are a couple of limited exceptions to that, but China is very risk averse still to getting cases brought in from outside or allowing cases to go unnoticed. So there are still, everyone's wearing masks on public transport. You're getting checked temperature and whatnot when you enter buildings. A lot of events are still virtual. Those events that are in person, if they're significant events involving the leadership, I'll go and do a COVID test and then stay until that result comes through and then attend the event. So life is not completely normal, but the virus is well under control. And in fact, we would say that the community transmission has virtually been eliminated within China, and that is a pretty impressive outcome, given the difficulty that everyone else is having in getting to something that's close to that.
No, you're spot on about the difficulty that everybody else is having. The dismal science of economics tells us a lot of this is about expectations, right? I think many countries around the world, most countries around the world, including Australia, would be really happy with 1 to 2% growth rather than a contraction this year. But I anticipate there will be some unique difficulties in China, just given the levels of expectation in that society. I wonder if I could just reframe that previous question a little bit. There has long been this debate between people who have taken 30, nearly 40 years of unbroken and rather rapid economic Chinese growth and extrapolated it forward another 30 years and built this future for China where that trend line is unchanged. There's another group that are concerned more about Chinese weakness than Chinese strength, looking at demographics, looking at environmental problems, looking at the sheer reality of the size of the Chinese economy. It's much more difficult to grow at even 6% a year if you're the second largest economy in the world than it was if you're the 20th largest economy in the world. So I'm kind of wondering how you see the COVID-19 pandemic playing into these longer term trends. Is this just a blip in the road for China, or is this something that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of China, economically at least?
Look, that's a very big question, and I'm not an expert on these things. I read a lot of things, and sometimes it confuses me more than enlightens me. My guess, and it's really just a personal view, is that this is going to be a blip rather than a major turning point for China. I mean, one of the constraints on growth at the moment is simply that the rest of the world is grappling still with the virus, and that's affecting all kinds of things that China normally does: exports, travel, the works. China's going through a lengthy readjustment process. It was growing at 8 to 10 to 12 previously. There are those that say that it could maintain those levels of growth, around 8%, for quite a period into the future, if only they did some things to the economy that they're not going to do, state-owned enterprises and so forth. Chinese leaders have got a pretty good sense of what everyone's saying about them, and they read everything too, and they do a lot of analysis about other people's practices and policies and experiences, and they've made decisions about what they're prepared to what they want to do in terms of economic policy and the impact on the political system. And they are consciously not doing certain things and consciously doing others. So we expect growth will continue to slow, to moderate or modulate over time. They've got a demographic trend that is affecting them. But at the same time, they're moving from investment to consumption and looking for higher quality growth and doing all kinds of things. So we expect they will continue on that path. For Australia's, as a major trading partner of China, we think they will probably succeed in their expected growth plans, and that's good for us. We think we've got a good future together, given the complementarities between our two economies. So we don't, there will be ups and downs. It's not going to be just a straight line, and there will be a curve in it. Whatever the line looks like, it'll begin to moderate. But I think COVID and the first half of 2020 will be an aberration. I don't think in 3 years' time you'll be saying, look at what COVID's doing to us. I think, well, who knows? I mean, this virus hasn't gone away, and as long as it's somewhere in the world, everyone has to deal with it. We're all expecting and hoping for a vaccine in the next 12 months. So I'm a bit, I shouldn't say such and such is going to happen in 3 years' time, but really, I think it will be more of a blip than a major turning point.
Well, if nothing else, 2020 has probably shocked everybody in the prognostication business. It's difficult to know what's going to happen in the next 2 months, let alone in the next several decades. But I appreciate your views on the economy. There's no question that that's of keen interest here in Western Australia, Australia more broadly in the region. I wonder if I could turn back to your day job, if you will. Obviously, it does involve economics as well, but diplomatically, to be charitable, the last year, and even pre-COVID, Australia's relationship with China has been more contested. I wonder if you might kind of lay out your principal concerns from an Australian perspective, and Australia's strategy for dealing with China in a more contested era, where we can't just focus only on the strength of the markets and the benefits there. It's more complicated.
Yeah, it's true. Our relationship with China, particularly, you could go back to, say, 2017. There's been a number of pressure points emerge. They've become more visible in the last few months. Our strategy for handling the relationship has always been, we define carefully what our interests are in this relationship, and there are certain steps we need to take to advance those and protect those interests. We have things that we need to do in this. The world is a more fluid place, more uncertain. We published a foreign policy white paper in late 2017, which talked about changes afoot in the global landscape, and Australia needs to work harder to maintain our security, our prosperity going forward. And we've taken some steps in the last little while to plug some gaps and build our own resilience, whether it's dealing with critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, our political donations laws, foreign interference, and so forth. At the same time, things have happened which we've responded to. We've said things about the way the maritime disputes are being dealt with in our immediate region, issues relating to Hong Kong, Xinjiang. Many of those things that we've done domestically are necessary and worthwhile in themselves. They're not targeting China. They don't necessarily have a connection to people offshore, but China has taken exception to some of those, and certainly the things that we've said, which they regard as transgressing their own interests, they object to. So the atmosphere, the climate between Australia and China has become more contested. We say the relationship is both complex and consequential. Our approach to the relationship is pretty straightforward. I mean, you will have heard the Prime Minister and other ministers say we approach this relationship with good faith, good intentions, goodwill. We look at, there are a lot of common interests or shared interests that Australia and China have. There is mutual benefit from this relationship. It's significant to us. It's important to China. We would like this relationship to continue to make progress. Now, at the moment, the atmosphere is cooler. We need to be patient, and we are. We are also resolved. We can see this relationship makes sense to both sides, but it takes two to make this work. And we are ready to move forward with the relationship. Areas where we can cooperate together, we're certainly happy to do so. The government announced a big initiative last year, the National Foundation on Australia-China Relations. That's now up and running. It's just finalising, or very soon we'll finalise its inaugural competitive grants round, and that will assist various bodies in our community to progress their own engagement with China across a whole range of areas. And it's that kind of thing. I mean, the relationship it's not just the government-to-government thing. Certainly there's a very healthy and strong business relationship which is built up, and there are a myriad of links at local government, universities, our institutions, law enforcement, defence, you name it. The number of people who've been to China, it's usually in a normal year, not this year, but a normal year, it's pushing, it'll get to 500,000 soon. We have about, it's 1.2 million Chinese would normally visit Australia in a normal year. Some of them like it and want to come and stay. And so we've got a great migrant population with China connections. A lot of people that I meet in China have visited Australia, they've studied there. So there's a lot more to it than just what governments do with each other. But of course, the government component is important, and that's why we're here.
You several times referenced the business community, and if you look back at the history of at least modern Australia-China relations, the business community played a very important role in forging the relationship, but also forging perceptions of China and the relationship back here in Australia. For businesses, there's always this tension between risk and reward, opportunity and risk in that regard. Yeah. I'm wondering if what you described as a kind of a cooler atmosphere right now, is that shifting the way the business community assesses that balance between opportunity and risk in China? Do they see China as a more risky place right now, and should they? Is there a greater level of risk for the business community in China today?
I think yes, there is, and that applies both mainly to a couple of sectors who, they've got to develop business plans with certain expectations about trade with China, which, at least in the case of barley growers and people that deal in grain or the grain industry, there is now an anti-dumping case that China has concluded, and they've introduced tariffs of 80% on Australian barley, and that has, I think, stopped the trade. So for that sector in particular, that is a very big shock and something which, well, the government, we don't believe is warranted based on the facts. And so we're pursuing with China through their internal administrative review mechanisms. We've sort of a review of that, and we have options down the track in other ways to pursue that. There's an anti-dumping investigation that's now been launched into the wine industry. And again, we would regard, we can't see how that's legitimate or justified based on the facts. So there's uncertainty for particular sectors. A couple of other sectors have been or are being affected by reported restrictions of various kinds. China has a fairly elaborate set of measures when it comes to licensing and also quarantine procedures, like many other countries. And if they were used to impede trade, then that would introduce risk. So I think our whole business community is well aware of those risks. And there's a level of risk also when it comes to living and working in China, and our travel advice is always reviewed and regularly fine-tuned and updated to reflect that the situation. At the moment, of course, our travel advice says don't leave Australia mainly for health reasons, and don't come to China for those reasons.
You won't be surprised to know that the agriculture community here in Western Australia, particularly the barley farmers and the wine, and even those in sectors not yet impacted, beef or milk, are keenly focused on the two cases that you've identified that you're working on right now. Having seen the behavior of the business community here, I find it difficult to imagine any producers in Australia being willing to sell any product to China for below the cost that it was produced. So the anti-dumping measures don't make a lot of sense to me in this context, but I can fully understand that. I wonder if I might address the broader question tied to that risk of Australia's project diversification, if you will. We at the Perth US Asia Center, in addition to listening to experts and practitioners like yourself from China, have made a concerted effort over the 7 years of our existence to get the business community, the government community, civil society more broadly in Australia to also pay attention to Japan, Korea, ASEAN more broadly, Vietnam, Indonesia specifically, India. So to diversify their views so we don't have such a deep concentration. Do you think there's a shift in Australia, that there's a recognition that we're overexposed in China? And if that is indeed the case, how does China react to that narrative? Do they see that as an anti-China narrative, or is that something that the project diversification, if you will, is that something that's understood or seen as hostile in China?
Well, you're right. I think people have realised that over-concentration on one market, on one customer, can be risky. China, I think, is now being seen as a less reliable trading partner. Certainly the barley industry would agree with that, and others are looking at what's happened there and are drawing the same conclusion. Of course, it's easy to say, let's diversify. We're a free country, the market economy, people make decisions. They usually go for business deals that are, make good sense and are likely to deliver quickly. And it's harder to make things diversify when the economic arguments perhaps aren't as easily valid there. But I don't know that China itself sees it as a negative thing. I mean, they themselves have a deep aversion to being dependent on one or two or even three sources for key inputs. And I think they would understand why it makes good sense not to put all your eggs in one basket. Of course, sometimes people use the diversification argument in ways that are a bit kind of, we don't want to sell to China because they're horrible people or whatever. That can be seen in a negative way. But I think broadly speaking, China understands. Of course, everyone, it makes good sense to have several options. Go for the deals that deliver the best outcome for you, but always be conscious that you don't want to be stuck if for whatever reason there's a problem with your main customer.
You earlier mentioned travel advisories related to China and the fact that you and your team are regularly monitoring, updating those. We recently saw the emergency evacuation of two Australian journalists, Bill Birtles and Mark Smith, out of China, leaving no Australian media organizations represented on the ground. I think for the first time in a long time. Is this a cause for concern? Is it part of a broader move towards, what might uncharitably be called hostage diplomacy, with Michael Spavor and Michael Colvig from Canada being under arrest? I'm kind of curious as to how you factor that into the current business and relationship environment as well.
Yeah, well, there are two things going on. One is China is less tolerant of negative media. So the United States and China have a separate discussion or dispute going on about journalists in each other's countries. And the upshot of that has been, or the upshot has been that quite a number of US journalists have been forced to leave China. Their visas have been revoked. Other journalists in China are finding the conditions under which they operate much more restrictive. The visas are being renewed for only short periods. In one case, someone got it only for a month, but others have had 3 months or even a year. I mean, and it's kind of, people feel they're on thin ice if they report in a way that is not welcome to the authorities. So there's that happening, and that is reducing the capacity of all of us to understand well what is going on in China, because the more objective journalists you have on the ground doing just various things, where it's the economy, society, political things, what's going on in Xinjiang, the better. It just helps us round out the picture. Specifically in relation to our travel advice, we keep a very close eye on, and it's not just here, it's every country in the world, what is the risk picture for Australians to live here, to work, to visit. And that has been adjusted over time as required, and we introduced a line into that advice in July that mentioned a fact that people know, but we felt it was necessary to put it in the formal advice, which is there is a possibility of arbitrary detention in China, and there have been a number of cases which would lead us to think that was something that we needed to remind people about, and so that's why we did that.
Nearly 9 months ago, as the scope and impact of the COVID-19 pandemic was becoming apparent even to us here in Western Australia, we at the Perth US Asia Centre quickly realized that there's no way that we could just hunker down and do nothing, and that we didn't want to become the all COVID, all day organization just focusing on COVID. And one of our promises to our own community, not just in Western Australia, but Australia more broadly and throughout the region, is that we would pay attention to those issues, trends, developments in the region that are really important and yet weren't likely getting the necessary coverage because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I might add in this month because of the intense interest on the US elections. So I'm wondering if I could kind of wrap up our conversation today by asking you to look forward. What's your prognosis, as difficult as that might be, for the Australia-China relationship? And as you address that broad question, what are the developments, issues that our community here should be paying closer attention to? So if there are underlying developments that during this era of COVID, and as we hopefully do get a vaccine and we come out of it and things resume, what should we know about that is happening or developing in China, and how does that impact the relationship going forward?
Well, that's a really good question. There's a lot of answers to that. Look, in terms of our bilateral relationship with China, I think the short term, it doesn't look particularly promising, but over the medium to long term, I'm more optimistic and confident. And that is because the main ingredients in our relationship, which are political dialogue, economic complementarity, and the people-to-people links at various levels, they're all operating still to various extents. COVID, of course, has paused most travel, so there's almost no tourism, or there's no tourism and not much education travel happening, but they will resume. And China's own growth is continuing. So I think our shared interests, our complementarity haven't gone away. And so it's a question of just waiting through until we get to a more calmer atmosphere in terms of the political relationship, and we're ready for that when it comes. What's going on in China that people ought to think about for the future? Well, urbanisation is still a very, very big trend here, and that is going to require a lot of metal, and that will keep pushing things along in terms of Australia's trading links. Some of the innovative and clever ways that China's going about using technology, communications within the country, fast trains and e-commerce and so forth, which are quite exciting and opening up. I mean, China is doing things that we haven't yet done in that respect. And I think it will be good when people can travel again, because they'll be able to come and see, well, what does a place like China look like? I mean, to some extent, it's doing its own thing. I mean, they don't have the internet connected to the global internet in the way that we would prefer, but within the country, they're doing a number of things. And I'm not a futurologist, and I've got a busy day job looking after all the other things you were talking about, but there will be, I think, interesting things for Australia to see and move with as China itself forges its own development path as it is doing.
Well, look, I have a long list of specific questions that I would love to ask you, but as you rightly commented, you do have a day job. We're really appreciative of you making the time to kind of share your insights with our broader community. And we look forward to a time when you're able to visit us here in person in Western Australia again, and that we in our broader business community in WA, as well as in Australia more broadly, can once again return to China. But in the interim, this is a nice second best alternative to be able to have this type of conversation virtually. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.